Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 135 of Petey's Awesome Guest Panel. Now, before we introduce tonight's iconic guest star, I would like to introduce tonight's co-host for this evening, all voice acting fans. First off, the guy that is the Ed McMahon to my Johnny Carson, and that is Mr. Christopher Patty.
Heyo.
That's your new nickname, man. I christened you my Ed to my Johnny. Introducing tonight also, another big fan of voice acting for the land from down under, Miss Jessie Devine.
Hi, guys.
Always great to have you, Jessie.
I agree big time. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Now introduce tonight's guest star for this evening. I want to say I've been a fan of this man's work for years, and he's been part of many projects like Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling, Gem, Transformers, and of course, one of my favorites growing up, Garfield and Friends. He is a very versatile voice actor and definitely one of a kind. He's one of my all-time faves. My guest at this time is Mr. Neil Ross. Mr. Ross.
What an introduction! You're shot out of a cannon. Nice to be here, guys. I'm looking forward to this.
So it's such a pleasure, sir. I mean, we're so glad to have you here. We've been a fan of your work for years. Like, I personally loved your work, like on Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling, and of course Metal Gear Solid as Colonel Vulcan.
Yeah. I never know how to pronounce that. Is it Vulcan or Vulcan?
I think it's Chris. Do you say Vulcan or
I think it's Vulcan.
Yeah, it's Vulcan.
Yeah. It's funny. That's you don't get as much reaction from characters you've done in games. At least I haven't. As much reaction as you do with the stuff that you do for animation. I don't know why that is, but Colonel Vulcan is the one exception to that. I do hear people wanting to know more about that, and I'm afraid I always disappoint them because most of those jobs, you're in, you're out, it's over, and it's a 4-hour period in your life, and I don't really have any great stories because it's just me and a director, and we do the lines, and they make a game out of it, and that's pretty much it. I don't, Whereas with animation, it just lends itself to stories for some reason.
Interesting.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of like the conflict that Ray Liotta had with Rockstar when he was doing the voice of Tommy Vercetti in GTA Vice City. And he pretty much said that video games are not like movies, and they're not pretty much best revered in like the same way as it would be like in most other art projects. But a lot of people would come to disagree with him, Rockstar included. And it was just, one of the reasons why they never brought him back for San Andreas. And also, I guess, that people have come to far more revere video games as art in the following years. Because it's right now, it's like, why would they be?
Yeah. No, I think it's fascinating. I probably won't live long enough to see it, but I've had this theory that as the technology improves, gradually games and movies will sort of merge, and you'll be in, Tom Cruise will still be making the Mission Impossible movies. He'll be up to Mission Impossible number 57, but in this one, you're in the movie. It's like a mashup of a movie and a game, and the player can be in the movie. I think something like that may be coming. As I said, I don't think I'll be around to see it, but that would be my guess as to where this is all going. But as far as I can understand, Mr. Liotta's, I think I know what he was talking about. It's got to be difficult for movie actors because they work with each other. They feed off each other's performances. Even if the person you're doing the scene with is not on camera, they're just standing off camera, feeding you their lines, and you're playing a scene together. And with games, I've never worked with another actor. They just don't do it that way. They bring each person in separately. And in a lot of cases, you are saying lines, you're reacting to the player, and the player is not there. So you have to sort of imagine what the player is saying to you and then react to that, which is it's a little bit difficult, especially I would think for somebody who's used to working with other actors all the time. So I can understand why he would say something like that. And I don't think he meant it in an unpleasant way. It's just a different way of working, you know?
So when you do video gaming, it's more like solo, and then like when you do animation, it's like an ensemble piece, right?
It used to be. Lately, they seem to be
Ooh.
bringing people in individually in animation and then just gluing it all together. In the old days, everybody had to be there, no exceptions. You were there for the day, the whole thing. And that's all gone away now. I think maybe that started when they began working with celebrities who are not as available as we were, because that's all we did was voiceovers. They're obviously doing a ton of different stuff. And so they have to grab them when they can get them. And so they gradually got used to working with people separately. I think that's what happened. But and this is a while ago. I came in to do something and I had a scene with Billy West. I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Adam on my show.
Oh, I love him.
Adam on my show.
I
Yeah.
love,
Wonderful
yeah,
man.
I love Billy West as
It's-
Fry from Futurama, Professor Farnsworth, Dr. Zoidberg.
Oh
And
yeah,
when you
he's
watch,
got a
yeah,
he's got a ton of characters. He's just
yeah,
an insanely talented guy. So
I agree.
anyway, we have a scene together in whatever this was, and I'm looking forward to working with him. And they say, "Okay, Billy, you come in. Neil, you'll be next." And I said, "What? We're we're playing a scene together. Why don't we both go in?" Both? Yeah, we would work together, Billy and I. And it was like I had said, "Why don't we jump on a duck and fly to the moon?" They were like, "What? Work together? I guess we could do that. Could we?" I said, "Oh, please forget I said anything. You're in charge. Do it any way you want." But I thought, my God, with this, we've gone from everybody must be in the session to everybody's working separately. And, you know, I just would have enjoyed bouncing off of Billy, and hopefully he would have enjoyed bouncing off of me, but they don't do it that way anymore, at least not much.
That's unfortunate. And
Yeah.
I have to ask you too, because we're gonna dive into the questions too, but I just have two quick questions before we start. First of all, I have to ask you too, like, because there's so many, like, there's Neil Ross, and then there's Neil Kaplan. Did you ever get to work with Neil Kaplan?
That's not ringing a bell.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay, I was just curious to know, and also, I also do want to talk about, sir, of course, your book, which is Vocal
Yeah.
Recalls: A Life in Radio and Voiceovers. Would you like to talk about that?
Here I have a visual aid here, boys and girls. This is the book. A hefty little number, isn't it? Even if
Yeah.
it bores the hell out of you, it makes a great doorstop. So yeah, it's available at Amazon. It is also available, the audio version, at Audible. And there is also a website where you can go to get information, and that's cleverly called www.neilbook, neilbook.com. And it's a rollicking tale of my adventures in top 40 radio, followed by my adventures in voiceovers, and hopefully a fun read. So, end of commercial. Thank you.
Well, I would definitely say it's definitely a fun read, because I'm already on chapter 4 of the book, because it talks about how, like, you went from like from Montreal to California, which is a really good read. I can't wait to read the rest of the book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the move from Montreal to California, which I discovered Peter Cullen did too. We're both ex-Montrealers. Yeah, I was 11, almost 12 when we did that. And I cannot describe the difference. It was like getting on a rocket ship and flying to Mars. I mean, Canada in those days, at least where I was living, I mean, to go to school, you had to wear a blazer and a tie. If huh?
Oh, we didn't say anything.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw somebody asked.
Oh, Jesse, I think you got your
That's
TV on again or something.
You got to mute your microphone.
Oh, no.
So, you had to wear a blazer and a tie. I mean, if you were a real rebel, you could wear a sweater and a tie, but you didn't want to do that too many times. And I get out to California and start going to Franklin Junior High in Long Beach. And it's like I walked on the set of Grease. Everybody's got Levi's and T-shirts with cigarettes rolled up in the sleeves and construction boots. And that was just the girls. the guys, the whole thing. And I show up in my blazer and tie, and kids are walking up to me in the hall going, who are you? What are you? Are you a teacher?
Sorry.
Okay.
I went home and I said to my mother, well, it's a little different around here. I'm going to have to make an adjustment in my wardrobe if I'm going to fit in. So it was just a much freer atmosphere. Canada in those days, at least the part I was living in, it was very, I don't know if the word conservative. You just were not encouraged to call attention to yourself. Let's put it that way. It was little uptight.
Wow. Well, of course, you've had an amazing career in voice acting. The first question we're going to start with is, how and when did you get your first big break into voice acting? Take us there.
Well, first I had to find out that voice acting existed. When I was a little kid, I was fascinated by the voices and the accents that I heard coming out of the radio that I had. And I would listen to those and I would try to reproduce them, not with any thought of making a career out of it, just for fun. Some kids build model airplanes. I sat in my room and talked to myself. At least that's the way my father put it. And fade in, fade out. I get into the radio business. I'm a disc jockey and production guy. And somewhere in the early 70s, I was talking to a record promoter from Los Angeles, and he mentioned voiceovers. And I said, whoa, I'd never heard that term before. And that's when I discovered there was this business where that's all people did. I had always assumed that these voices that I heard in movies and television shows, on commercials and cartoons, etc., that they were all face actors who were doing this stuff on the side. And I guess some people did fit that category, but I found out there were people who just did voiceovers and had agents and the whole deal. And some of them were doing very, very nicely. And I sat and took stock of all the various little dopey skills and talents that I had, and I thought, if I sat down and tried to invent a business for me, it would probably be voiceovers. This is perfect. This is what I need to do. And it took me a while to make it happen. In those days, there were really only two cities where you could do voiceovers. It was either Los Angeles or New York. You had to physically be in one of those two places. And neither one of those places is somewhere you go and with no money, because they're hideously, nowadays they really are insanely expensive. But even back then it was kind of tough. And so what I was trying to do was get a radio job in LA. And then I thought I will artfully segue out of radio and into voiceovers, but I've got to get to Los Angeles. It took me a while to pull that off, but I finally got a job there in 1978. And by 1983, the tail was wagging the dog. I didn't really need to be in radio anymore. I was doing so well in voiceovers. I hung around for another couple of years, but the early 80s, that's when I made my move.
Interesting. And of course, we had a follow-up question to that too, which is where Chris is going to ask. So Chris, your first question?
What inspired you to become a voice actor?
Well, I like the idea of it. I've never been drawn to face acting. I sometimes I wonder if I even could have pulled something like that off. It's just the whole concept of voice acting appealed to me, and it was something that I really wanted to do badly. And you kind of have to have that drive. People say, should I get in the business? And I say, well, if it's like, well, this looks like fun and you can make a lot of money, maybe I'll give this a try. I don't think that's going to be helpful. You have to just burn with a passionate desire to do this kind of work. And even back then, and it's gotten a lot tougher as the years have rolled by for various reasons, which we can go into if you want.
Absolutely.
But I just craved it. I fell out of love with, well, the thing is, and my dad had had it right. He was not a big fan of mine, and he said, "You're lazy. You just won't apply yourself." And truthfully, he was right. I'm no good at working hard at something I don't give a damn about. If I hadn't discovered radio and voiceovers, I'd have taken some stoogey job and just gone through the motions and probably ultimately got fired because I just wasn't doing a good job. But as it was, I was lucky. I felt passionately in love with the idea of working in the radio business. And when that began to fizzle out, here came voiceovers. And again, that surge of desire and energy to do this stuff, it built back up again. And I've been very lucky. I found two passions in my life, and some people never find any, you know?
True.
So,
And
well, I was going to say, though, I think there's also a little bit of variation on how video games themselves go about acting as well as voice acting, because you do have the motion capture actors as well as the actors themselves who do the voices doing the parts. And similar to a movie, they actually go back and forth off of one another. And we've seen that in LA Noire. We've seen that in Grand Theft Auto 5. We've seen that in God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2, Red Dead Redemption 1. I think Grand Theft Auto 4. And yeah, I think it's been like a go-to method of a lot of the homegrown games these days. And I'm sure like the games that are given translation, and such as the Metal Gear games, yeah, they definitely just like bring you guys in for the voice acting, and so you can't really go back and forth off of one another that way, which is a bit unfortunate. And if you ask me, you guys should be able to go back and forth off each other. But yeah, there is definitely like a variety that has actually changed over the years following the advancements in technology.
I agree.
is that a question?
Oh, well, not a question. And I was just
okay.
like tacking on to what we were talking about earlier and how
Right,
video games
right.
like do voice acting.
Right.
Oh, and I gotta also ask Mr. Ross too. Jess, before you ask your question, I just want to confirm if this is true or not, because on IMDb they can either say stuff that's true or not, and I just want to get it confirmed by you though. You did play John Arbuckle's cousin George in that Garfield and Fred episode, right? I just want to confirm that you did or not.
Huh.
He was a DJ.
You know, I may have. All I did on Garfield, I was never a regular. They would bring me in to do what they call incidentals or non-recurring characters that are in just one episode and never heard again. Sometimes they'll like something and they'll say, "Oh, let's write him into another episode." But everything that I did on Garfield, I was a guest. And I may have done that.
Can I tell you how it sounded?
But I have no memory of it. I couldn't, if I got on the stand and put my hand on the Bible, I would have to say I have no idea.
Can I tell you how the character sounded like?
Sure.
You basically did like a Casey Kasem parody. It was like, "Hey, great to have you here, cousin." You know, number 5, we got steamed carrots, like that kind of thing.
Huh. Okay. Again, the bells are not ringing. I'm sorry. I just can't confirm or deny that.
But can you confirm that you were also the Cyclops in the SpongeBob movie?
That I can confirm. For some reason, I remember that he said such clever things as. But yeah,
I remember
that is my only involvement with SpongeBob.
But you were the guy in the suit, right? You were just doing the voice, right?
Yeah. No, I although oddly, I did before I discovered radio, I did flirt with the idea of being a deep sea diver, but I never did anything about it.
Oh, you would have nailed that, sir.
Yeah.
When we had Greg Berger on the show,
yes,
we actually asked about like his time on Garfield, and he was at least definitely finding the roles that he was on and very memorable because he was a regular on the show himself.
Yeah.
He played Orson, and he also played, what was his name? Lloyd
Odie,
the Mouse?
Odie. He played Odie.
He was Odie the dog.
Yeah. Okay, so Odie the dog. And yeah, when we actually asked him about like another show that he did, but didn't really remember too well, which is Gary and Mike. And he did like a few appearances on that show, did some episodes, but yeah, he only recalled it was like maybe something he did back in the early, as he put it. And unfortunately, yeah, just like stand out that well for him. And so if everything just blurs together, it's understandable.
It is.
Yeah, I would just, you know, the way to think about it is whatever you folks do for a living, just imagine something happened. You're not probably old enough to have these memories, but 15 years ago on a Wednesday for 2 hours, what did you do? Well, you have no idea. You couldn't tell me, even if I said, "Well, I've got the log here, and it says you did blah 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 and blah," and you say, "Well, I guess I must have done that then. I just don't have any memory." And that's kind of how it is for us. You come in, you make your Z, you get out, and you get back on the freeway and go and do something else, hopefully. And you know, some things stick in your memory, and some things don't. And especially you know a one-off character, it's just gone.
Yeah, it reminds me of that a line delivered by Gomez Adams himself, who played M. Bison in the Street Fighter 2 movie, where he says, "For you, the day I graced your village was the most important day of your life, but for me, it was Tuesday."
That's a good line.
If it's Tuesday, it must be Garfield. I don't know.
Yes. Well, he hates Mondays.
Yeah.
Jess, your question.
Are there any methods or preparation you do for specific voiceover role?
You really can't do a lot of preparation because you don't know what you're going to encounter. Uh, the late James Earl Jones, I didn't hear this. Somebody else heard it and told me about it. Hopefully it's true. He was doing an interview, I think, on NPR, and the host said something like, "Well, you're doing voiceovers now. That must be an easy buck." And Mr. Jones, according to the person that told me this, replied, "No, on the contrary, it's one of the hardest things I've ever had to do." Really? Why? Well, when you do a movie or a television show or a play, you get the script way in advance. You have time to think and mull it over and do research and plan. He said, voiceovers, you walk into a studio, they thrust a script in your hand and expect you to perform immediately. And I find that very intimidating, you know, and I can understand that, but that is the job. Most of the time you walk in and you haven't got a clue what you're going to read for, what they're looking for. All you've got are the 15, 20 minutes in the waiting room where you see a drawing of a character and some lines of dialogue and a description of the character, and you go over this material in a very brief space of time, try to picture a voice in your mind for that character, or perhaps two or three. And then when they call you in for the audition, you try to reproduce those into the microphone. But the preparation is all in the workshops and the classes that you take. And then you sort of learn by doing, you know. A lot of people are hesitant to try something. I'm not going to go in till I'm 100% ready. Well, you're never going to be 100% ready. I'm not 100% ready now, and I've been doing this stuff God knows how long. I mean, you get as prepared as you can, and then you jump into the void and try to fill it. And so the only preparation I did, there was a period in the mid 80s when there was just so much work out there, and I was doing so many different characters that I had to carry a little cassette recorder around with me that had recordings of these various characters I was doing. And I would sit in the parking lot before I went into the studio, and I would listen to that character's voice to remind me, oh, okay, this guy. Yeah, okay. And then I would go in. But really, the preparation happens sometimes years before you actually perform the role, if that makes any sense.
It does. And Chris, I know you have another question. I just want to ask Mr. Ross really quickly too, like, because we had, I want to get your opinion on this because you mentioned like how it's like, so, all the times we're not prepared for like, what kind of thing we can do in our roles. Like, I want to give you an example of something that actually happened. This is a true story. During Lion King, when they were filming, they were recording the song "Be Prepared." Jeremy Irons blew out his voice box with one line, so they had to get Jim Cummins to finish the rest of the song. Though, have you ever encounter a situation where like during a recording situation where someone blew out their voice so they had to get someone who sounded just like them to take their place to carry on the scene?
Uh, Not that I can recall. Not that I can recall. That's a very special circumstance, and kudos to Jim for pulling that off. I'm a lousy. I can do voices, but I'm a lousy impressionist. But Jim is phenomenal. Uh, his Sterling Holloway is just magnificent. I mean, he could call Sterling's mother and say, "Hello, Mom," and she'd buy it, you know.
I will say one thing too before Chris asks his question that I absolutely loved your role like as Colonel Logan because it's to me like you're just an amazing storyteller in general, but the way you deliver the line as Logan, I felt like I was watching like a real life movie. Like I felt like his anger every time he hit somebody. I felt that it was just incredible, like your performance in that. I just
Oh, thank you.
kudos.
Well, that was a meaty role. You know, you live for those things. A lot of times the stuff that you're doing is not that rewarding. I mean, you're grateful for the work, but really you're not challenged much. But that was a nice part, and I'm very happy to have done that.
Amazing part. Chris, your question?
Are there any methods or preparation you do
We,
for specific voiceover roles?
we just did that question.
Oh yeah, did we? Fuck me.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Just cut
Well,
that
I
part
mean,
out,
I'm
please.
happy to repeat the answer if you want.
You don't have to. You don't have to if you
That's up
already
to
went over
Chris.
it. And sorry if I was just like not heeding what we were like talking about here.
No worries.
So then on to the next one. Uh, how do you see the voice acting industry evolving in the future?
Which we just talked about.
Wow. That, of course, is the $64 question. At the moment, we are on strike for video games, and the sticking point appears to be AI.
Wow.
And we are concerned that I probably shouldn't speak for the negotiating people. We are concerned about AI, and we need to come to some kind of accommodation with the employers. And I'll just say that. Uh, Boy, I don't have a clue. I have seen, as I mentioned, I started out in the mid 80s, so that's 40 years. And back then in Los Angeles, and as I mentioned earlier, the only two cities where you could even do this work were Los Angeles and New York. And really the only city you could do animation was Los Angeles. There was no animation in New York that I know of in those days. Still isn't, as far as I know. There may be the odd show here and there, but LA is where this stuff happens. And I was talking to a guy who started a business called The Voice Caster, where he cast voices. Prior to that, nobody really specialized in casting voices. You would either read auditions at your agent's office, or you would be brought into a casting place where they mostly did on-camera casting. And they would get a little tape recorder and hang a microphone off a fishing pole and say, "This voiceovers, we've never done this before," you know. And Bob Lloyd was this man's name. He started the Voice Caster, and long term, but they're still around. He's retired. Somebody else owns it now, but that's what they do. And anyway, I was talking to him in the early 80s as I was trying to break in, and he said there's about 600 people working full time in the Los Angeles area doing voiceovers. I said, that sounds intimidating. Well, when I wrote the book, Vocal Recall, A Life in Radio and Voiceovers, I talked to a woman named Kathy Kalmanson, who's with a company called Kalmanson and Kalmanson, and they do voice casting. And she told me that she had on her computer her A list, the people she thought were the best talents. And I said, "How many people are in that list?" And she said, "About 30,000. And I said, 30? How the hell does anybody make a living in this business anymore?" with that much competition, because of course what happened was right around the turn of the century, the early O's, as the internet got more and more reliable and technology improved, and we had, in my opinion, an ill-timed strike, and suddenly the buyers discovered, well, there's a whole country out there we can draw on for talent. And now you no longer have to be physically present in Los Angeles or New York or anywhere. If you've got a decent studio set up, you can work from home wherever that happens to be. Now, there are some projects where they say, no, you must physically show up at a studio in Los Angeles, and if you can't do that, we can't use you. But an awful lot of work is now nationwide, and the competition has just gotten insane.
COVID changed things.
Huh?
COVID changed things.
Yeah, well, of course, that was what really pushed it over the top. Was there were people who said, I will not do it that way. You must come to the studio. And suddenly, well, we can't do that. And suddenly, well, I guess maybe I can work this way. But there are still people, even after the COVID thing, that certain projects, they say as they send the audition out, if you're not available in the Los Angeles area, don't bother, because we can't use you.
So the biggest factors in, like, would you say would be the introduction of AI and COVID were big factors, like, in changing the voice acting industry currently?
Well, COVID definitely. AI, I don't know. Time will tell.
Reason I ask that is because Chris has a lot of good knowledge about AI. So, Chris, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, when we had Mr. Mahan on the show recently,
Gary
we
Mann.
also talked. Yeah, Gary Mann. And when we recently had him on the show, we talked about this as well. And yeah, he sort of like addressed it as a concern, and he pointed out that AI is currently in its infancy, and as things stand are right now, they don't exactly have all the kinks worked out. Because I've listened to like AI podcasts before, or rather AI stories, with the narrators, because they're not exactly like necessarily the same as you would hear from like a real person. They don't get the word pronunciations right at times. Sometimes the inflection is just off. You can tell it's just robotic at times. But in some instances, they will actually like change the inflection for certain characters that are being narrated for, or they're being voiced for. And at the same time, I mean, you'll still like hear that it is AI, but it's just like another thing that's going to be worked on in the future. And it also makes me think about how in Star Trek you had the holodeck, and sooner or later, when AI makes its advancements that are going to be far enough along, not only are we going to see a replacement of the voice actors, but we'll see a replacement of the Hollywood writers, which honestly, with the way things are written in Hollywood, I'm not really going to miss.
Well, it sort of depends. They do crank out something good every now and then. Yeah, we just don't know, because AI is in its infancy, as you point out. A friend of mine who's kind of tech savvy, he found some kind of free AI program that he could download and play around with, and he sampled my voice and he wrote something, and he had me saying something I've never said. And sent it to me, and it wasn't perfect. You could tell it wasn't really me, but damn, it was scary. And I think that's the great fear, is that they can sample our voices and pay us $35 and say, well, see ya, and just use the voice, forever. And my question would be, how expensive is it to do this AI? I mean, you've got to have the equipment, you've got to pay technicians. At some point, isn't it just simpler to bring the actor in and get the performance you want, as opposed to tweaking something electronically for hours on end? I don't know. I know that the late James Earl Jones, to bring him up again, apparently he signed a deal with Disney where they can do this with his Darth Vader voice. I think by this point he had gotten to the age where he really didn't want to work anymore, and he set up some kind of a deal. and went ahead and let them do that.
He may have also known that Star Wars was going to outlast him.
Yeah. So it kind of makes sense in a situation like that, but you don't want to see a business where that's 100% of the work, and suddenly we're we're at the unemployment office.
Would you say also too?
Sure, okay.
Oh no, I'm just gonna be really quick with this, and you can ask, because I was curious to know, like, if this is a fair assessment, Mr. Ross. Is it fair to say too that what AI is doing right now with actors and actresses is the equivalent of like getting deceased celebrities to appear in commercials?
Yeah. Well, in the case of deceased celebrities, usually that is because their estate, their surviving family members have agreed to that and are being compensated, and the person is legitimately no longer available. So again, that's a situation where AI kind of makes sense.
True.
But the idea that, and again, it's so hard to tell. I mentioned my friend. Well, he had this little program that he got for free, and it's not perfect. It has its glitches. But what is that law where in computers, where every 6 months the technology advances a certain point? I've forgotten, but it's going to get better. I mean, when we talk about these video games, the first video game I ever did was in the early 90s. It was called Stunt Island, and it came on floppy disks. Do you guys even know what floppy disks were?
I do remember floppy disks very well.
I do.
Okay. And I only did 9 lines in this game. I was the only voice, and the director said 9 lines is all we have room for. And I don't know how many years later, not too many years later, I'm doing Mass Effect as the narrator, and I am recording hours and hours of verbiage that they have room for, along with all the other actors who were in Mass Effect. I mean, the quantum leap from floppy disks to Mass Effect in a relatively short space of time. So you could imagine, God knows how good AI is going to get. It's scary.
It is.
Frankly.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, and when you talk about how at one point your friend used AI to use your voice or make your voice, I can't help but think that if they're going to be doing more Darth Vader lines, like say maybe make a Darth Vader TV series, or maybe have him come back for the next Kenobi season, they would actually have Hayden Christensen, since he's still got plenty of decades left, to continue on as Anakin Skywalker. But they could actually just use him to voice Darth Vader, but at the same time use James Earl Jones's dub as Darth Vader. Have him say the lines, but also just dub him over, and just have it match his delivery as well as his emotion. Because if you remember from A New Hope, Darth Vader was a lot more emotive than he was in the following sequels. Because when he boarded the initial ship that Princess Leia was on, you remember how angry he could be when he was actually talking to the stormtroopers. He's like, find her, tear the ship apart, find those plans, and find me all the passengers. I want them alive, or something like that. I forget how the line went, but yeah, he definitely showed actual emotion and wasn't really just cold and firm as he would later be in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, well, characters evolve depending on what the writers give. Have you ever seen somebody got a hold of the Star Wars footage involving Darth Vader, and they dubbed in lines from another movie James Earl Jones did called The Great White Hope?
I gotta watch that.
Which was about the boxer Jack Johnson. Well, it's pretty funny. It's got to be on YouTube or somewhere. It's quite amusing. Let me just leave it at that. But
I want to check that out. And you mentioned characters too. We want to talk about some of your characters you played too. And one of the characters you played that I'll always remember was Springer on Transformers. memories of working on
Yes.
Transformers. And then do you have any behind the scenes fun or funny behind the scenes stories you could share during the recording session?
Yeah, I was, a lot of these funny moments, they fall into the category of you had to be there. They're ad libs that were thrown out in the middle of something and taken out of context. They're really hard to explain. I do have, in fact, I put it in the book and I bookmarked it here because I thought I might read it for you because it's kind of inside baseball. In order to explain this, I have to talk a little bit about how they did animation back in the day. So, with your permission, open our hymnals to page 328.
Okay, let me open my page.
All right. I've already sung Frank Welker's praises, but there's a story I tell about Frank in Transformers conventions that fans seem to enjoy, so I'll share it here. I've already mentioned that overlapping your dialogue with another actor's dialogue is usually a big no-no in animation. The editors might need to slide the dialogue around a bit due to picture considerations, so you have to leave a tiny pause between lines. It can literally be a nanosecond, but it has to be there to give the engineers razor room. That's a term dating back to the days of analog audio tape when the engineer would edit by physically cutting the tape with a single-edged gem razor blade. How quaint that sounds in this digital age. Frank had to do a long scene in which two of his characters were having a heated discussion. Usually, when an actor has to play both sides of a conversation, the director will give him the option of recording the first character and then going back and doing all the lines for the second character. Then an editor has to piece the conversation together. In this instance, Wally was looking down at the storyboard and lost track of the fact that Frank was doing both roles. Frank didn't hesitate for a moment. He launched into the scene, and the rest of us just stood there in awe. Frank was on fire as he ping-ponged between the two characters at lightning speed. If you'd closed your eyes, you'd have sworn two actors were working. It was breathtaking. Suddenly, Wally interrupted. "Hold it, we got to go back. We had an overlap." There was a stunned silence, followed by a chorus of us shouting, "Wally, it's all Frank. How could there be an overlap?" Needless to say, Wally was very apologetic, and Frank just grinned and said no problem and did a second equally brilliant take. I don't tell this story to embarrass Wally. It was an honest mistake. But the fact that an experienced director like Wally with thousands of episodes under his belt was fooled into thinking he'd heard an overlap shows just how blazingly fast Frank was moving between characters. Not very hilarious, but an interesting story. That is how good Frank is. He is to watch him work is just amazing.
Just how he can balance two different characters at the same time.
I mean, it's not easy. I have a scene, and you can find it on YouTube. I was the Green Goblin in Spider-Man, the animated series.
Yeah, right there. And
I was also Norman Osborn. So they wrote a scene where Norman Osborn is looking in a mirror and he's turning into the Green Goblin and back to Norman and back to the Goblin, back to Norman. And I had to do both parts. And I had completely forgotten about this. And somebody called it to my attention and they said, "Did you do that all in one take? Or did you do it in separate takes?" And I wish I could remember. I just cannot remember. I like to think I did it in one take, but I could be wrong. I gotta say, I was relatively inexperienced when I started doing Transformers and G.I. Joe, and we were doing these shows more or less simultaneously, just different days of the week. But I learned so much in those sessions because rather than go out in the green room and tell dirty jokes with the other actors, I would sneak into the control room and sit on this couch behind the director, Wally Burr, and I would watch people like Frank Welker, Chris Latta, Frank Welker, Michael Bell, and I learned so much just watching these people work. I can't. It's interesting. I've done a lot of workshops, and I never learn anything when it's my turn to read. It's all a blur, and I read it, and they say that was good or that was lousy, or you need to fix this, you need to work on that. But as I sit in the audience and watch other actors struggling, and I'll say, I see what he needs to do. I see how he could fix that. Oh, geez. Somehow, watching really good people, you learn from them. And I learned so much in those first GI Joe and Transformers sessions. I can't even begin to tell you. That was such a wonderful cast. So many gifted, talented people. Peter Cullen, you mentioned Greg. He was there. I mean, I'm leaving people out.
But was Sue Blue or Pat Fraley there?
Well, obviously I had scenes with Sue. Scenes with Sue. Say that fast 15 times, and you can get into voiceovers. Yeah, I must have worked with her. Isn't that funny? I mean, sometimes actors were not available, and they would say, "So and so isn't here, so we're gonna, we'll pick his lines up later." Pat, yeah, Pat was there, and Sue was there. Sure.
Okay. There was another name too, because I feel like he was part of this, around this group area too, and that was are you familiar with Richard Cancino or Mike Sorich?
Neither one of those are ringing a bell. I'm sorry.
Not a problem. I was just curious because it looked like it was in that category. Because you mentioned Michael Bell, because I had him on my show, and Philip Proctor. Was Philip Proctor another name that was in that group or no?
Yeah, I don't recall working with Phil on Transformers or GI Joe. I may have. You got to remember, we weren't all in every episode. In other words, if you're watching an episode where my character is running around and shooting a gun but never says anything, I wasn't there when they did that episode. Unless you had a line of dialogue, they're not going to call you in. And so there were a lot of sessions that happened that I wasn't there for, and you know.
I understand. And also, Chris, for your next question, I made an error on this, so you can ask the question though, but I made a mistake because on the Voltron though, because yeah. So go ahead and ask that question.
Well, are you saying he didn't
No, he
work
was
on Voltron?
like you were on Voltron, right, sir?
Yes, I was Commander Keith and Pidge, and
don't ask you to do Pidge, please.
Yeah, I tried doing that voice one time. I couldn't really nail it too well.
Yeah, I was not the narrator. I was just one of the characters.
So that was my error. Because I really thought because of your history through narration that you did the narration. Not because I really thought that.
No, the big narration thing for me, as far as games and animation, would be Mass Effect. I was the codex narrator on Mass Effect.
Okay.
And yeah.
No,
I've done a lot of narration over the years, but not involving animation. I did about 25 episodes of Nova for public television. Yeah, just a lot of narration over the years.
Oh, okay.
Also a bunch of shows for JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. You can find those online. Actually, just put in JPL, and you will see a bunch of really interesting shows. I'm not narrating everything, but I'm in there quite a bit.
Very cool. And Chris,
and I can also just appreciate that you did Voltron, because that was probably the first anime I was ever introduced to. And I didn't really start getting into anime until I actually saw Vampire Hunter D on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Mm-hmm.
That's what really that pulled me in. But at the same time, Voltron sort of was nonetheless a pioneer. I didn't necessarily even know that it was originally from Japan, because I was probably, I guess, 1 year old when I first saw this show itself,
mm-hmm.
And I watched it again years later when it aired on Toonami, when I actually, of course, have a more complex mind, and you kind of just come to appreciate it, what they did for the show, the voice actors, the voice roles, the expressions, and the deliveries for the lines themselves. And yeah, you, sir, are a legend in my eyes for helping out with that show.
Oh, thank you very much. That was an unusual show. I didn't realize how unusual because I was really just getting started. But what had happened was the folks who put the thing together had bought the rights to actually 3 Japanese shows, and the original idea was to bring them back and revoice them in English, and just that would be the project. But then, for various reasons, they discovered that that wasn't going to work. So they would commission original storylines and then comb through all this footage they had, trying to find scenes that reflected what they had written. It had to be just an insane process, but somehow they pulled that together. We voiced the thing without ever seeing a frame of footage. We had no idea what these characters looked like. You know, we had no idea of what the visual of the show looked like. We saw nothing until it got on the air. And we were doing stuff to already existing footage. So in addition to the challenge of acting, you also had to do the lines in a certain time frame to match the lip flaps of your character. So you would you would get a script and it would say, you know, 2 of you go around the back, the rest of you come with me, and then to the right of it would be 4.9. Well, that you had to do that line in 4.9 seconds, so it would fit the character's mouth movements. And if you know, if the line reading was fine but too long, you had to go back and do it again. And sometimes it was maddening, especially the longer lines. You'd be 0.2 of a second long. You do it. Now you're 0.2 of a second too slow. Now you're here. Now you're. It was just maddening. But and excuse me, because of hang on, because of the fact that we were doing it that way, we couldn't work as a full cast. We came in and did our lines individually. You know, I would show up, Peter Cullen would be leaving, I'd go in, do my part, I'd leave, Michael Bell would be coming in to do his part, this kind of thing. So we never worked as an ensemble. So it was very different from the way G.I. Joe, Transformers, and all the rest of them were done. Because in that instance, of course, once somebody has written a script, the first thing you do is record the voices. Then the animators animate to those existing voiceovers. But in Voltron, we were doing it in reverse because the footage already existed. Interesting little tidbit.
Yeah, and the thing about with like how Voltron was recorded and how it was dubbed here in the U.S., unfortunately, there were like quite a few things that they had to change to adhere to American standards and practices. It's the 80s, and they want to make sure it's kid friendly. And one thing that really bothered me most about the dub itself was the fact that Sven wasn't really wounded; he was actually killed off. And who we see later on isn't really him; it was actually his brother, his twin brother. And yeah, it just kind of bothered me that they would like be okay with killing off Optimus Prime. Eventually, they'll bring him back.
Yeah, that was a huge mistake, in my opinion. But you see, what they wanted to do was introduce a whole new line of toys. So they decided, oh, we know what we'll do. We'll just kill off all these existing characters and replace them with new characters. Well, you know, the death of Optimus Prime, a lot of people I've spoken to, that was one of the most traumatic experiences of their youth. Walking into a theater at the age of 12 and dealing with the death of a major character like that. And it essentially killed the movie. Once word got out, the people stopped showing up, and the movie initially was a bomb. And only when it was re-released on videotape and then later on DVD, and the fans had gotten older, and knew what, and began to reevaluate the movie as as an older audience, and it became quite successful on VHS and DVD. But the initial theatrical release, you know, and I thought they didn't respect the characters, and they didn't respect their audience. It was like,
These kids, they won't give a damn. We'll put somebody else in and we'll sell all these toys.
well, no, it doesn't work like that. I mean, my God, what's a really big popular Succession? You know, if you suddenly yank one of the main characters out of Succession and replace him with somebody nobody's ever heard of, it would be idiotic. They wouldn't do it. But in animation, they were ready to throw it all away just to try to sell some new toys. So
yeah, and that's kind of like what impacted what happened in the G.I. Joe movie, the cartoon movie, of course, not the more recent live action, where they were going to kill off Duke, but instead they just had him be wounded and be comatose.
Yeah. Well, by then the Optimus Prime disaster had happened. In the original version of the G.I. Joe movie, Duke was also going to die. But by then it was like, oh, no, we better not do that. In fact, that was supposed to be, the G.I. Joe movie was supposed to be released theatrically. But Transformers had bombed so bad, they said, no way. And they just turned it into a 5-episode miniseries. And, but that, yeah, I mean, it was, he's not dead. He's just in a coma. And he will regain consciousness when his toy starts selling better.
Well, I'm so glad they didn't kill it off, though. And we have a couple of questions before we wrap up, too. First of all, I just want to say I absolutely loved your performance, like on Rugrats, where you played the judge. It was an episode called Pickles versus Pickles, and you were the main judge in this episode, where Angelica was suing her parents to kind of similar to the Gary Coleman thing, where she was trying to get a divorce from her parents. And you played the judge, who was literally on Angelica's side, and basically was biased towards her. So I just thought you did an excellent job. It was a nightmare, but you played the nightmare role really well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Rugrats was another show where I never had a regular part. They just kept bringing me in to do these incidentals, which is fine, you know.
And Michael Bell was on that show too. So actually, you did a
Yes.
with Michael Bell in that in the court scene where you as the judge and him as Drew, doing a scene where you're like, Mr. Pickles, if you don't hold her, I will hold you in contempt. You were really good.
Yes, Michael and I have crossed paths many a time over the years, and he's another one. It's just a delight to work with him. He's so talented, so gifted.
Oh, like you, he's a total sweetheart. I had him on my show 3 years ago. He's a wonderful man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jess, you have one of your final questions for Mr. Ross?
Of course. Hey, what do you hope your legacy is in the voice acting community?
Yeah, I had a coffee with an actor years ago who actually his name was Chuck McCann. You may be
I know him. Yep.
With him.
Oh, yeah, I loved his work.
Yeah. And he did all kinds of stuff. I don't even get me started. I mean, he did a kids show in New York in the early days of television where you had to fill like 3 hours, and he just made it all up with puppets because they had no budget. And he was in movies and television shows and on and on and on and on. Anyway, sometime in the, I don't know, 60s or 70s, he did a series of commercials for Right Guard. You can find them. They're on YouTube. Basically, the premise is a guy goes into his bathroom and he opens the mirror where the medicine cabinet would be, but there's no back to it. There's just another guy staring at him, and it's Chuck, and he says, "Hi, guy. I'm the guy in the next apartment. Are you using Right Guard? I'm using this Right Guard here." But the big thing was, "Hi, guy." And then the thing ends with the guy turning around and facing the camera and saying, "Mona." He's calling for his wife, like this. What's the deal with the medicine cabinet? Anyway, these commercials were really popular. So Chuck and I go out for coffee, and the waitress comes over and she looks at him and she goes, "Hi, guy." And he goes, "Yeah, it's me. How you doing? Nice to meet you." Blah, blah, blah. And I said, "Does it ever kind of tick you off that all the stuff you've done for 40 years, and all they seem to remember is, "Hi, guy." And he said, "Neil, I'm grateful if they remember anything." And I thought, what a wonderful attitude. I'm going to adopt that attitude. So, what is my legacy? I don't know. I will just be grateful if anybody remembers anything, you know?
Yeah, and you know what? One of the questions too I had to ask, one of my final questions I had for you was, you had so many roles. Of course, one of my favorites I mentioned before was Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestle, where you played as Mean Gene, and that show itself had a great cast. I mean, you had Charlie Adler, you had James Avery. I believe you had
Yeah.
Lou. Was Lou Ferrigno in this or no?
No, there were no actual wrestlers.
Okay.
No actual wrestlers were harmed in the making of this cartoon. No, everybody was an actor.
What was the name of the guy that played Hulk? I'm trying to remember what his name was.
Yeah, he went on to all kinds of fame and fortune. Brad Garrett.
Brad Garrett, that was the name.
Was Hulk
Oh,
Hogan. Yeah.
I love
Hopefully
Brad
he
Garrett.
lived a life. Hey, I'm just hoping that he lived more of a life of integrity than Hulk did.
Well, as far as I know, I've lost contact with him. But yeah, I mean, we had James Avery before he got on television and became famous on Fresh Prince. And then we had Brad, who was just starting out. He told us tales of, he was a stand-up comedian. And he told us tales of opening for Frank Sinatra in Las Vegas and how much that meant to his parents, who were huge Sinatra fans. And then, of course, he went on to huge success on Everybody Loves Raymond, and
I love that show.
Me too.
yeah, that was a wonderful show. And the last time I was in Las Vegas, I think he's got a club there now, Brad Garrett's Comedy Club or something like that.
Cool.
So he's doing very well.
Mr. Ross, I have to ask too, because this is going to lead to my next question too. And Chris and I are huge wrestling fans, and we are old school wrestling fans, like going back to the 80s and 90s. Could we hear a little bit? Could you still do your Mean Gene Okerlund voice?
I'm not sure I could even do it back then, but it's somewhere in here. Mean Gene Okerlund. He was a radio guy briefly. He worked where the hell was it? Omaha, I think. And he was a character, I'll tell you. Dealing with those guys had to be. I early in my career, when I was in Honolulu, I was the track announcer for the roller games.
Roller derby?
Yeah, well, they call them roller games.
Okay.
I think there's two different companies, or there were, but that's the closest I came. It was similar. They had villains and heroes, and obviously certain things were prearranged, shall we say, and it was a very colorful group, and I wish I'd been a bit older. I was so young, I didn't really appreciate how unusual and interesting this experience would be. I just kind of went, it's $10 a night, here I come.
And you had a radio voice too. I was curious to know, did you also ever have an encounter with Gary Owens, the late great Gary Owens?
Oh, sure, yeah. I crossed paths with him many times. We were at the same radio station briefly. He was no longer on the air, and I remember bumping him into the hallway and saying, what's wrong with this picture? I'm on this station and you're not. How can this possibly be? Because I thought Gary Owens was one of, in the pantheon of disc jockeys, he was right up there in my top 10, maybe top 5. I mean, he was a remarkable, talented, funny guy.
Would you say Casey Kasem would be in that category too, or no?
Oh yeah. And Casey is interesting because he came along at a time when everybody had to have one of those kind of baritone voices to be on the radio. And you could be a blithering idiot, and as long as you said stupid stuff in a nice deep voice, the managers said, "Oh, listen to that voice, he's wonderful." And I would say, "Yeah, but listen to what he's saying, it's idiotic." "I don't care, I love that voice." And here came Casey Kasem, and he didn't have one of those kind of voices at all. He was somewhere in here. And by God, he went on. He probably became, if you're going to use money as the yardstick, he was the most successful disc jockey who ever lived. But an interesting thing I would like to point out that probably most people haven't thought of, his big success was American Top 40. I'm sure you remember that.
I remember that.
Yeah. And it was a disc jockey show. It was counting down the top 40. It was a weekly show, but it was scripted. He was not ad-libbing. He didn't ad-lib a word of that. It was all scripted for him. So it really wasn't a disc jockey job. It was a voiceover job. He was taking something somebody else had written and interpreting it. And that was the thing with Casey, because when he was just a local DJ in Los Angeles, he was already, I didn't know, I met him a few times. I didn't know him well, but I'm told he had this just astonishing work ethic. And while most disc jockeys would do their 3 or 4 hours and go to the nearest bar and hang out and tell lies, he was zooming around town, going to voiceover classes and going to voiceover auditions. And he went on to become, I think, arguably the most successful disc jockey who ever lived. And he did it without having one of those voices, you know.
He put his own spin on it.
Hats off to him.
Absolutely. One of the final questions we have before we wrap up too, sir, and I got to ask you, because you've been part of many projects, you've impacted my life, you impacted Chris's life, and many other fans' life. So my question for you is, what do you think of the impact that your work has done, whether it's Gem, whether it's Transformers, whether it's Voltron, has on OG fans like myself and Chris, as well as newer fans like Jess, and years after its initial release of your projects?
Yeah, it's astonishing. If you had told us back then that this would happen, we'd have said you need to be institutionalized. In those days, the common wisdom was an animated show would last about 3 years. Its audience would outgrow it, and it would disappear and never be thought of again. And here we are, 40 years later, and people showing up at conventions and wanting to meet us and get our autographs. We never would have believed it back then. And it is a lovely gift. And, people at conventions sometimes will express something along the lines of what you just said and thank us for our performances. And I got to turn it back around and say, thank you, the audience. Without the audience, we're nothing. We won't exist. And I got to spend 40 years doing something I loved, thanks to the loyalty of the fans. And so you're thanking me, I'm thanking you. I got to spend my entire adult life doing something that I enjoyed, that inspired me. How many people can say that? A relative handful. Most people have to show up somewhere and do some job, and I mean, somebody's got to do it. Thank God they're willing to do it. But I got to, Monday mornings were not like, oh God, Monday. It was like, okay, what are we going to do today?
What do we do?
A whole different thing. So thank you.
Thank you. And this is a quick question too. Like, have you ever worked on Filmation, the company, the animation company, Filmation?
Yeah, it's funny. I knew the son of the owner, but no, I never worked there.
Okay.
Never worked for Filmation.
The reason I asked is because every single voice actor or actress I've had on my show, I always ask them that question because I was curious to know what it was like working for Filmation, because it was a very unique company, because these are the people that put out Fat Albert. They put out that combination between the crossover between Groovy Ghoulies and Looney Tunes. And they also came out with, I could be wrong on this though, they came out with the Star Trek animation series, which came out, I think, in the 80s.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I happen to remember that because I went to one of the early Comic Cons, and somebody had a booth displaying the animated Star Trek, and I was there with the son of one of the Filmation owners, and we were kind of chuckling and taking note of this. They also did He-Man, which is huge. I mean, Alan Oppenheimer, who played Skeletor, is mobbed at these conventions. They can't get enough of him, and that show's even older than Voltron and G.I. Joe. But It's funny. It's funny what people remember, because there are other shows I did where we worked just as hard, had just as much fun, and nobody remembers a frame of them. They did disappear.
I can't.
It's funny what sticks and what doesn't, and there's no way to predict it. No way in hell. Nobody knows anything, as William Goldman cleverly observed in his book. You know, you just come up with something and hope the hell it works.
It's either hit or miss, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're gonna wrap up soon, so Jesse, your final comments and or questions for Mr. Ross.
Of course. Hey, I enjoy you doing the. Thanks for doing the voice of the Cyclops from SpongeBob movie while someone else does the character. The
Yeah.
movement.
Well, you're more than welcome. My pleasure.
And
My pleasure.
and I'm so glad I got to learn the rest of your filmography, like Rugrats and all the other voice work.
Well, thank you. I'm glad.
You're very welcome.
Christopher, final comments or questions for Mr. Ross?
Hey, you know better. Just call me Chris now.
Sorry, man. I just because I love you so much, man. I try to be very proper when I speak.
I'm not one of those people. Just call me Chris.
I know. Sorry.
Anyway, so yeah, Mr. Ross, I definitely appreciate your work. I had no idea that you contributed so much to my childhood, more than I realized, and it's also that we gotta probably also look at that. Nostalgia has always had a place in everybody's heart because I suppose as far back even when Voltron was around, when Voltron was still fresh, there was still an embrace for nostalgia with people who were introduced to Star Trek: The Next Generation who still appreciated Star Trek: The Original Series. You also had people who were introduced to the Tim Burton Batman who remember the Adam West Batman fondly. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, even though some things might be out of style compared to what we have now, and some may have actually thought that they would even be just a one-off thing, maybe go on for 3 years, like you said. As it turns out, a lot of that stuff can actually have a lasting impact, and a lot of people can always appreciate the work you do, the work everybody else does to make those projects that make an impact on other people's lives, to entertain us, as well as even give us life lessons at times. And so for that, I thank you.
Well, you're more than welcome. Yeah, a lot of times fans come up and they say, thank you for making my childhood. And I always reply, well, thank you for making my middle age. It's true, you know. And again, as I said, the fact that people even remember at this point is such a gift, and I'm very grateful for it.
Awesome. And before I say my final comment, I do have my final question, which is, what's next for Neil Ross? Now, Mr. Ross, this is part of the show where you could talk about, say anything you want. I would literally pass you the proverbial microphone right here, but I see you're already covered. So right now,
yes.
The floor is yours, Mr. Ross.
Here's my lovely Shure SM5B with the KMPC mic flag, which actually was in the KMPC control room in the good old days. Nice. What's next? Geez, I don't know. I mean, I'm getting up there, boys and girls. And
you think you're good?
I still have a lot to learn. But you know, the life of a voice actor, you really don't have control over anything. You just put it out there and hope something sticks. So I honestly don't know. Hopefully I get to keep doing this for a while longer, and that's all I can say.
The end is not the end, they say.
Yeah. Well, there's an old line attributed to a Shakespearean actor where he says, you start out as one of the guards, then maybe you get to play Laertes, and maybe If things go well, you actually get to play Hamlet himself, and then you get a little too old for that, and you start playing the king or maybe Polonius. And if you get much older, you play the gravedigger, and then you become the skull. And I'm not ready to be the skull just yet. We'll see.
I will say too, Mr. Ross, I just want to say thank you for an amazing interview. I will send you a copy of this. It's going to be up definitely by today because I'm very quick with getting this up, though. I just want to thank you for an amazing interview. And I just also want to thank you for, like, again, because you said, a lot of people say thank you for making our childhood. You already got me covered on that because you did make a ton of my childhood. But I just want to say thank you for those memories you gave me, not only watching like Jem growing up, watching Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling, watching Spider-Man, playing Metal Gear Solid. Like talking to you right now, I feel like that little kid that did all that things, like watching you perform. Like, and I'm not gonna lie to you, and I say this to every single guest star, and I mean this when I do, because this is my way of showing my appreciation for guest stars like you, and that is, you have this incredible gift, sir, where you can take a 30-something-year-old fan, whether it's myself or Chris, this high, and bring him way down here, make him feel like that little boy again that did watch any of your programs or did play any of the video games that you did star in, sir. Just want to say that.
Well, that was heartfelt and sincere, and I deeply appreciate it, Pete. Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you folks.
Absolutely. And I just want to say one last thing before we conclude, though. Like I said, I'm going to send you a copy of this interview when it's done. And, we're going to do something special for you before we conclude, though. I just want to say thank you again. And I really hope one day we do get to meet at a convention, because I would love to, one day meet you, because like you can see right now, I probably would act the same way I am talking right now, which pretty much feel like a little kid just finally getting that wish to finally, interviewing that one voice actor he always liked growing up. And I used to study voice acting since I was 9. Like you tell me like names like Mel Blanc, Don Messick, Doris Butler, like you name it. Even you mentioned Billy West too. Before I even did this podcast, I had my very first interview with Billy West when I was 19 years old in high school, and he probably remembers this too. Like, because like as a project, we had to interview like people we want to do for our careers, and I chose voice acting. And my assistant principal landed me a phone call with him to get an interview. Years later, I was a co-host for another show, a podcast, and I got to interview him a second time. And then for the first time, ever in like years, I got to interview Billy on my own podcast, this time as a podcaster. So it was just voice acting has been a long way for me. Like, and I love voice acting. We're gonna conclude with the following, and that is thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you,
Neil.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, one and all. I appreciate it.
Have a wonderful day, sir, and I will get this interview up pronto.
Yeah, shoot me a link and I'll put it on my Facebook thing.
You got it, sir. You have a wonderful night.
Couple more viewers for you.
Thank you, sir.
All right, have a good one, guys.
You too.
You too, Neil.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.